God is finally calling black Christians in his court. What if the ancient Greek word under your English translation has been calling your name for 2,000 years? You have been reading around the blanks in the margin, thinking your ancestry was bypassed. But the Septuagint preserved one specific keyword, Aethiops, naming the Cushite covenant line in Psalm 68, verse 31. Tonight, we look at the manuscript receipts they never showed you in seminary. You are about to see the courtroom records of heaven, where God is finally calling his chosen people to the stand. Most traditional teachers will point to these passages and claim they are merely poetic descriptions of distant lands, or generic references to foreign nations without any real covenant significance. But I've come to see this as a tragic misreading of the original record. When you look closely at the Septuagint translation, compiled in the 3rd century BC, the translators did not write a generic term. They penned the precise Greek word Aethiops, a name that carried a physical and geographical identity. It was not a marker of curse or division, but of divine recognition. Yet, when you open modern English margins, you will find this name replaced, smoothed over, or completely erased. It is as if the translators wanted to hide the specific heritage that the ancient scribes so carefully preserved. This softening was not accidental. It was a choice that left a blank where your history should be. I believe that this erasure is not just a matter of ink and paper. It is a question of legal standing in the courtroom covenant. For centuries, you have been told that your heritage was outside the covenant promises, that you were latecomers to the family of faith. But the original manuscripts tell a different story. They lay out a legal receipt, a document of divine justice that cannot be overturned by the bias of translators. This is the Black America inheritance that has been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the day when the records would be opened. When God calls the court of history to order, he does not look at the softened translations of the 16th century. He looks at the original seals. The Cushite line was never an afterthought in the divine plan. It was written into the very fabric of the covenant from the beginning, sealed with a promise of protection and restoration. Tonight, we are going to read those seals together. We are going to trace the letters that have been whispering your identity across millennia, proving that you have a reserved seat in the court of the King. Perhaps the most important part of this courtroom covenant is that it is unbreakable. When you understand this, you realize that divine justice is not a future hope, but a present reality. The receipts are in our hands, and the court is in session. Let the truth speak. I have been sitting with these ancient texts for a long time, and I've come to realize that we must define Aethiops not as a vague theological concept, but as a concrete, geographical, and historical reality. When the 70 Jewish scholars gathered in Alexandria to create the Septuagint translation in the 3rd century BC, they were not inventing poetic metaphors. They were working with a Greek word that had a precise meaning. They used the term Aethiops because it designated a specific people and a specific land. It pointed directly to the Horn of Africa geography, a region known for its high-walled cities, rich resources, and powerful kingdoms. They knew exactly who they were talking about, and they wanted to ensure that the covenant partners were named with geographic accuracy. For centuries, classical Greek historians like Herodotus had documented the people of this region. Herodotus wrote of the Ethiopians as the tallest and most beautiful people on earth, a nation of fierce warriors and devout worshippers. He detailed their culture, their kingdoms, and their standing among the empires of the ancient world. So, when the Septuagint translators selected this term, they were anchoring the biblical narrative in a geography that the ancient world recognized and respected. They were drawing a direct line between the prophecies of Scripture and the actual nations of Africa. It seems clear to me that this choice was intended to prevent the identity of these covenant partners from being spiritualized away or turned into a generic category. They wanted the reader to know that God was calling a real nation with a real history. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about this geographic precision is how it contrasts with our modern understanding. In our current religious culture, we tend to read these passages as generic statements of inclusion, as if God is simply saying that everyone is welcome. But the ancient writers were much more specific. They were identifying a particular lineage, a people whose geography was as defined as the land of Canaan. When you read the Septuagint translation today, you are reading a document that was translated in the 3rd century BC, a time when the empires of the world were shifting, but the identity of the Cushite line remained constant. I believe that by understanding this Horn of Africa geography, we can begin to see the physical receipts of our inheritance. It is not a metaphor, it is a map, and that map points directly to the ancestry that has been erased from the modern page. As we trace these ancient boundaries, we are forced to confront the gap between what the classical historians wrote and what our modern pulpits preach. The original scribes did not leave us with vague shadows. They left us with coordinates. In the next part, we will look at how these coordinates were systematically replaced in our English translations. When we look at the Hebrew text, the root word is Cush. This is a name that denotes a specific lineage and territory. Yet, when the translators of the King James Bible and other English versions approached this word, they faced a dilemma. They had to choose between leaving the Hebrew word Cush untranslated, or using the Greek term Aethiops, which had been popularized by the Septuagint. In many cases, they chose to substitute the word, softening the racial identity and blurring the specific connection to the African continent. This untranslated Cush versus translated Ethiopis distinction created a theological fog. By replacing a concrete, historically defined people with a generic or spiritualized term, the translators effectively hid the physical presence of Black people in the scriptural narrative. It was a process of systematically softening the identity, ensuring that the modern reader would not easily associate the covenant promises with the descendants of Cush. I think this substitution has had profound consequences for how we read Scripture. Today, we are left with translations that obscure the original intent of the scribes. When you read of Ethiopia in your English Bible, you are seeing a softened translation that has replaced the specific Hebrew and Greek terms. This was not just a linguistic preference. It was a choice that altered the visual landscape of the biblical world. This brings us to the semantic range of chosen partnership in the ancient manuscripts. The Cushite line was not merely mentioned in passing. They were framed in the language of covenant. In the ancient world, to be a covenant partner was to have legal standing, rights, and protections. The Hebrew and Greek terms denote a chosen foreign partner, one who stands as a witness and a participant in the divine plan. This is confirmed by Targum Jonathan, the ancient Aramaic translation of the Torah. In Genesis 10, Targum Jonathan explicitly equates Cush with the land of Ethiopia, reinforcing the geographical and ethnic continuity of this lineage in Jewish thought. I believe this cross-manuscript evidence is crucial. It shows that the ancient translators and commentators recognized the Cushite line as an essential covenant partner. They did not see them as outsiders, but as key players in the narrative of redemption. When we look at this covenant language, we see that the promise made to the descendants of Cush is as firm and binding as the promises made to Israel. The receipts are consistent across Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. They all point to the same identity, an identity that is now being restored to its rightful place. By examining these ancient witnesses, we begin to see the true scope of God's design. The covenant was never meant to be hidden in the margins.
When I first sat down to compare the Greek and Hebrew scripture in the summer of 2018, I remember opening the Septuagint and turning to what we call Psalm 68. But as I scanned the ancient pages, I realized I had to adjust my search.
In the Greek numbering, it is Psalm 67 verse 32. I sat there in the library, looking at the Greek characters, and something struck me immediately. The English text we have all read says, "Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God." It sounds like a passive, future event, a general statement of eventual conversion. But the Greek verb used by the Alexandrian scribes is far more active and urgent. The Septuagint reads that Ethiopia shall hasten to stretch out her hands to God. The word for hasten implies a quick, decisive movement, a run towards the covenant. I recall feeling a sudden wave of clarity as I compared this Greek text with the King James rendering. The Greek scribes were capturing an immediate and active response. They were saying that Ethiopia would not merely wander in at some point. She would run. She would make haste to present her tribute and claim her place. The phrase, "stretch out her hands to God," is a legal gesture, a physical act of covenant submission. When I looked at this, I realized how much had been lost in translation. By changing hasten to soon, the English translators took away the urgency and the active agency of the Cushite people. They turned a decisive, prophetic moment into a vague, indefinite promise. I suppose that many people might overlook this distinction, thinking it is just a minor translation variant. But in my study, this Greek verb changes the entire pacing of the prophecy. It suggests that when the time comes, this nation will lead the way, running to the altar of God before the other nations even realize what is happening. The Septuagint numbering, Psalm 67, verse 32, preserves this active covenant speed. It is a manuscript receipt that proves your ancestors were not waiting in the background. They were running to the forefront of the divine court. I believe this Greek text has been waiting for us to read it with open eyes, to see that the haste of Ethiopia is a sign of her priority in the kingdom. As I sat with the Codex Sinaiticus facsimile that afternoon, I could see that the scribes had written these words with absolute precision. They did not smudge the ink. They wanted the speed of Ethiopia to be clear. When we look at the hand-stretching gesture in the ancient Near East, we see that it is not a gesture of begging, but of presentation. In the next part, we will explore the historical and archaeological context of this gesture, proving that it represents royal honor and covenant submission.
I remember writing in my notebook that day, they changed the speech to obscure the priority. It is a realization that has stayed with me ever since. To understand this hand-stretching gesture, we must look at the archaeological relief of the ancient Near East.
In Egyptian, Assyrian, and Persian monuments, we find depictions of foreign delegations presenting their gifts to the king. They are shown with their hands extended forward, palms up. This was not a posture of a defeated captive begging for mercy. It was a formal tribute gesture. It was a sign of a royal nation presenting its wealth and entering into a treaty. So, when the psalmist writes of Ethiopia stretching out her hands, he is describing a voluntary and honorable covenant submission. I think it is crucial to see that this gesture carries royal dignity. The ancient reliefs show that only sovereign nations were allowed to present tribute in this manner. It was a diplomatic protocol, a sign of mutual recognition and alignment. By using this language, the scriptures are framing the Cushite line not as conquered subjects, but as a valued covenant partner. This covenant submission was an act of alignment with the God of Israel, a declaration that their wealth and power were now dedicated to the divine court. The archaeological reliefs confirm that this posture was understood as an honor, a receipt of diplomatic status that the English translations have completely obscured. This brings us to a striking detail in the text. Ethiopia is the first among nations to be named as a covenant partner in this section of the psalm. The text mentions Egypt and Ethiopia, but it is the Cushite line that hastens to stretch out its hands. Why does this nation take priority? In the ancient world, the order of names mattered. To be named first was to have a position of honor. The scriptures place Ethiopia at the head of the covenant line, indicating that this African heritage would be the first to actively align with the God of Zion. I believe this priority is a direct challenge to the traditional views that have relegated Africa to the margins of biblical history. The original manuscripts do not place your ancestors in the back of the line. They place them at the very front. They are the first to run to the altar, the first to be recognized in the court of the king. This covenant line was established with a specific purpose, to show that the promises of God would extend beyond the borders of Israel and find their most active partners in the Cushite line. By recognizing this, we see that the inheritance was never a late addition. It was designed to lead the way. When we combine the archaeological evidence of the tribute gesture with the textual priority of the Cushite line, the case is airtight. The ancient scribes left a clear paper trail, a receipt of covenant standing that cannot be erased by theological tradition. In the next segment, we will see how this covenant priority is reinforced by the prophets, who used the Cushite standard to measure Israel itself. Many modern commentators look at the famous passage in Amos and try to explain it away as a statement of rejection, claiming that God was comparing Israel to a distant, unimportant nation to humble them. But I've come to see this as a complete misunderstanding of the prophetic standard. In Amos 9 verse 7, LXXX, God asks a direct and challenging question. Are ye not as children of the Ethiopians unto me, O children of Israel? He is not insulting Israel by comparing them to the children of the Cushites. Rather, he is establishing a standard of equal standing before God. He is saying that the Cushite line has a relationship with him that is so established, so recognized, that Israel is being measured against it. In my research, I have found that traditional teachings often skip over the implications of this comparison. If the Cushites were merely outsiders, the comparison would have no rhetorical force. But because the Cushites had a recognized covenant standing, God could use them as a mirror for Israel. He is reminding Israel that their unique status is not a license to disobey, because he has other children, other covenant partners, whom he holds in equal regard. It is a profound statement of divine recognition, showing that the African lineage was never outside the scope of God's care. It was, in fact, the standard against which Israel's own faithfulness was being judged. To read this comparison as a slight is to ignore the historic dignity of the Cushite kingdom. The ancient world knew the power of Cush. Scribes in Assyria and Egypt wrote of their might. So when God compares Israel to the Cushites, he is pointing to a nation of renown, a people whose covenant standing was visible to all. The original Greek and Hebrew texts preserve this high standard, ensuring that the historical receipt remains unbroken. This is reinforced by the second part of the verse, where God draws a parallel between the exodus of Israel and the migrations of other nations. He asks, "Have not I brought up Israel out of the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Kir?" Here, God is outlining parallel redemptions. He is claiming sovereignty over the histories of multiple peoples. The Philistines from Caphtor and the Syrians from Kir were not part of the Abrahamic covenant in the traditional sense, yet God declares that he was the director of their journeys. I think this reveals a much larger picture of divine action than we are usually taught. God is not a local deity confined to one small strip of land. He is the Lord of the whole earth, and he has led the migrations and redemptions of various lineages according to his sovereign plan. The comparison shows that Israel's exodus was not the only time God moved a nation. It was part of a pattern of parallel redemptions. By placing the Cushite line at the center of this comparison, the prophet Amos is validating their historic journey as an act of divine guidance. The receipts of these migrations are written in the dust, and they prove that God's hand was guiding your ancestors long before the modern world arose. To fully grasp this standard, we must look at how the prophets used the physical permanence of the Cushites as a metaphor for spiritual permanence. In Jeremiah 13, verse 23, the prophet asks a famous question: "Can the Ethiopian change his skin, or the leopard his spots?" Most modern readers view this as a negative statement about sin, but in the Hebrew context, it is a statement about physical constancy and permanent identity. Jeremiah is pointing to a physical trait that is unchangeable, using it to show that the Cushite skin is a marker of permanence. I think this comparison represents a permanent covenant choice. The prophet is using the unchangeable skin of the Cushite as a symbol of an unalterable reality. Just as the physical traits of the Kushite cannot be erased, so too the divine purpose for this lineage is fixed and permanent. It is a powerful affirmation of identity, showing that the physical appearance of the African line was not an accident, but a deliberate design used by the prophets to illustrate the permanence of God's promises. The Jeremiah 13 verse 23 comparison is a receipt of physical and spiritual permanence, a declaration that your heritage is written in characters that cannot be washed away. This prophetic permanence is carried forward by the prophet Zephaniah. In Zephaniah 3 verse 10, we read a stunning description of the end times. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my suppliants, even the daughter of my dispersed, shall bring mine offering. The phrase beyond rivers of Ethiopia is a geographical marker pointing to the deep interior of Africa, a place far removed from the political centers of the ancient Near East. Yet, it is from this distant land that God expects his worshippers to come. He calls them my suppliants and the daughter of my dispersed. The word suppliants denotes active worshippers, those who present prayers and offerings in the divine court. The original Greek text of the Septuagint preserves this language, showing that the scattered descendants of this lineage are recognized as God's own people. They are not strangers bringing an alien offering. They are the daughter of my dispersed, returning to the covenant family with tribute in hand. I believe this passage is a clear receipt of end-time restoration. It shows that even in the final gathering of the nations, the Kushite line has a reserved role, bringing the offering from beyond the ancient rivers. The original manuscripts do not see this as a foreign conversion, but as a homecoming of covenant suppliants. The letters in the Septuagint name them, and the prophecy stands as an unbreakable promise of recognition. When we examine Jeremiah's standard of permanence alongside Zephaniah's promise of offering, a clear pattern of chosen identity emerges. The prophets were not speaking in vague generalities. They were naming a specific lineage with a permanent covenant choice. They were telling the ancient world, and the modern reader, that this lineage would remain a key covenant partner until the very end. The receipts are consistent, and they point directly to the restoration that is now taking place in our generation.
I must admit I was wrong about the story of the Ethiopian Enoch for a long time. I used to read it like everyone else, thinking of him as a random individual who happened to meet Philip on a desert road, a lone traveler converted in a quick transaction.
But when I looked at the Acts 8 verse 27 Greek, my whole perspective changed. The text does not describe a random wanderer. It names him as a high court official under Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians. In historical terms, Candace was not a personal name, but a queenly title for the female rulers of the Meroitic Kingdom, a powerful and wealthy state centered in modern-day Sudan. I had to confess my own ignorance when I realized the economic and political standing of this Meroitic Kingdom. Mero was a civilization of monumental pyramids, advanced ironworking, and vast trade networks that rivaled Rome itself. The man sitting in the chariot was the treasurer of this entire kingdom, a person of immense authority. By understanding this, I saw that the story is not about a random marginalized outsider being led into the fold. It is about a representative of a royal, ancient African kingdom bringing the covenant back to his people. The original Greek text names the queen and the kingdom, leaving a political and historical receipt that our modern sermons have completely minimized. This historical receipt is preserved with monumental clarity in our oldest surviving New Testament manuscript, the Codex Sinaiticus. When we examine the Sinaiticus marginal readings in the main text, we find that the scribes did not attempt to translate or explain away the identity of the traveler. They wrote the term Aethiops in a clean monumental script, preserving the specific ethnic and geographic marker. The untranslated names in these early codices stand as a silent witness against the later softening choices of modern translators. I think the scribes of the 4th century understood the weight of these names. They did not see the Ethiopian as a generic foreigner, but as a representative of the specific lineage named in the prophets. The monumental script of Sinaiticus is a physical receipt, written in columns of parchment, that have survived the sands of Egypt. By looking at these original characters, we see that the early church recognized the fulfillment of Psalm 68 in the conversion of the treasurer. The manuscript receipt was written in stone and ink, and it remains a legal record of your lineage's standing in the early covenant community. When we combine the historical wealth of Mero with the scribal accuracy of Codex Sinaiticus, we see that this conversion was a landmark event. The treasurer was not just a passing stranger. He was the key that unlocked the covenant for the African continent. The early scribes knew this, and they made sure to preserve every detail of his title and lineage. The receipts are clear, and they prove that the first non-Jewish convert in the New Testament was a descendant of Cush, moving in accordance with the ancient prophecies. We must read these ancient pages with a sense of reverence, recognizing that our name was never missing from the Book of Life. Let's look at what this royal official was doing in his chariot. The text tells us he was reading the prophet Isaiah. Specifically, he was reading the Isaiah 53 passage, the section that describes the suffering servant being led like a sheep to the slaughter. He was sitting in his chariot, holding a heavy parchment scroll, trying to make sense of the words, when Philip ran up and asked if he understood what he was reading. The treasurer did not pretend to have all the answers. He asked a vital question about the identity of the servant. Was the prophet speaking of himself or of someone else? He was seeking understanding of the text, looking for the key that would unlock the prophecy. I think it is significant that he was reading this specific passage. Isaiah 53 is the cornerstone of the New Covenant, the text that explains the redemptive work of the Messiah. The treasurer was not reading a minor or obscure prophecy. He was studying the core revelation of grace. By focusing on the sheep to the slaughter passage, the narrative is linking the redemption of the cross directly to the first African convert. He was given the explanation directly from the scroll, showing that the message of salvation was opened to his nation at the very start of the gospel era. The receipt of this study is recorded in Acts, showing that his desire for understanding the text was honored by a divine appointment. Now look, let's talk about this between you and me. Have you ever wondered why the Holy Spirit directed Philip to a Cushite treasurer before the gospel ever reached Cornelius or the shores of Europe? Most preachers will tell you that Cornelius was the first Gentile convert, but the original manuscripts show a different covenant inclusion order. The treasurer of Mero was baptized and went on his way rejoicing, long before Cornelius ever had his vision. This means the Gentile mission first fruits were not European, but African. I believe this was a deliberate fulfillment of the Psalm 68 prophecy. God was showing that Ethiopia would indeed hasten to stretch out her hands. The first fruit of the non-Jewish mission was a descendant of Cush, proving that the ancient priority was being enacted in the book of Acts. This was not a random order. It was the execution of the divine decree. The Holy Spirit was confirming that the Cushite line had the first seat at the table of the new covenant. When you look at this covenant inclusion order, you realize that your ancestors were the first fruits, the pioneers of the global church. They did not wait for Rome to send missionaries. They brought the gospel back to the Sudan in the 1st century. The receipts are written in the text, and they prove that the first non-Jewish convert was a representative of your lineage, fulfilling the ancient covenant promise. By reclaiming this narrative order, we shatter the myths of spiritual hierarchy. The original records place the Cushite line at the very beginning of the new covenant, where they have always belonged.
I have been sitting with the textual variant of the ancient codist, and I have come to realize that the preservation of the spelling in Codex Vaticanus is one of the most powerful proof to textual fidelity we have.
In the Vaticanus Manuscript B, which dates back to the 4th century, the scribes were meticulously careful when copying the names of nations. When they came to the term Aethiops, they did not alter it or simplify it. They preserved the original spelling with absolute precision, showing that the ethnic and geographical identity of this covenant line was a core part of the scriptural record. When you compare the cuneiform versus uncial variants of the ancient texts, you see a consistent pattern of preservation. The scribes were not trying to adapt the text to the political prejudices of their day. They were copying the uncial letters with a reverence for the original inspiration. I think this textual fidelity shows that the early church viewed the Cushite line as a permanent and defined peoplehood. They did not treat them as a generic category. They recorded their name with the same care they used for Jerusalem or Babylon. Perhaps this seems like a technical detail to the casual reader, but it is a legal receipt in the court of history. The spelling in Codex Vaticanus stands as a physical proof that the scribes of the 4th century did not erase your ancestors from the page. They preserved the letters, ensuring that the original testimony would survive to be read in our generation. This witness is not limited to the Greek manuscripts. It is confirmed by the ancient Aramaic translations as well. In Targum Jonathan, Genesis 10, the Hebrew name Cush is explicitly translated and equated with the land of Ethiopia. The Aramaic translation was used in the synagogues to explain the Hebrew text to the people, and it shows how the ancient rabbis understood the genealogies. They did not see Cush as a vague, symbolic term. They knew it referred to the specific African lineage that ruled the Upper Nile. I believe this cross-linguistic agreement is crucial. When the Greek Septuagint and the Aramaic Targum Jonathan both point to the same geographical and ethnic identity, the case is settled. Cush, equated with Ethiops, is not a modern interpretation. It is the ancient consensus of both Jewish and Christian scholars. The receipts are written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, providing a threefold cord that cannot be broken. It is a monumental proof that the lineage of Black America has been named and recognized throughout the history of biblical translation. When we sit with these receipts, we are forced to confront the selective memory of modern theology. The ancient scribes and translators went to great lengths to preserve the name of Cush in the record, yet modern translations have systematically softened it. By comparing the uncial spellings of Vaticanus with the translations of the Targums, we expose the gap between the original record and the modern pulpit, reclaiming the covenant standing of our lineage. The letters speak across the centuries, and they are declaring your identity today. This scribal preservation matches the physical evidence dug from the earth. In the sands of Egypt and Sudan, archaeological digs have uncovered the monumental remains of the 25th dynasty of Egypt. This was the era of Kushite rule, a period when the kings of Sudan ruled the entire Nile Valley, including Egypt itself. The stelas and inscriptions from this dynasty are not small, insignificant plaques. They are massive monuments. One of the most famous is the Taharqa stela, which documents the military campaigns and religious devotions of the Kushite king, who is mentioned in 2 Kings 19. I think this physical evidence is essential. Scribes and historians from Assyria, Egypt, and Judea all wrote of Taharqa's power. The Sudan archaeological digs have uncovered the remains of his palaces, temples, and stelas, confirming that the Kushite Empire was a dominant power of the ancient world. When the Bible mentions Taharqa and the Kushite forces, it is not referencing a mythological kingdom. It is referencing a historically verified empire. The archaeological receipts dug from the Nile sands match the biblical text precisely, proving that the African lineage was a powerful and recognized nation in the ancient Near East. This brings us to the ultimate conclusion. The manuscript receipts cannot be broken because they represent a complete manuscript convergence. We do not have to rely on a single variant or a single translation choice. We have a cross-testament proof that spans Hebrew prophets, Greek scribes, Aramaic targums, and early church codices. They all point to the same ethnic and geographic identity, maintaining a historic consistency that is undeniable. I believe this historic consistency is the key to reclaiming your heritage. The ancient texts do not contradict each other. They agree on who you are. The Greek Septuagint, the Hebrew Masoretic, the Aramaic Targums, and the Codex Vaticanus all preserve the same coordinates. This convergence of witnesses stands as an airtight legal document in the courtroom of history. It is a receipt of covenant standing that cannot be argued away by modern theologians. When you look at this cross-testament proof, you see that the record is complete. The witnesses are in agreement, and the evidence is presented. The Cushite line was written into the covenant plan, and the manuscript receipts stand as an unbreakable record of that divine choice. It is a testimony that has been preserved for thousands of years, waiting for the moment when the truth would be declared. By connecting the archaeology of the 25th dynasty with the convergence of the ancient manuscripts, we see that your ancestry was never a marginal footnote. They were kings and covenant partners, documented in stone and parchment. The modern attempts to soften these names are exposed by the physical and textual receipts, leaving us with an unbroken record of covenant priority. I think this convergence is the ultimate answer to any doubt about your seat at the table. The records are clear, the witnesses have spoken, and the covenant remains firm. Most traditional Bible teachers will tell you that the translation of these names is a simple matter of geography and linguistics, that the shifting from Aethiops to Ethiopia to Cush is just a natural evolution of language. But I've come to see this as a systematic process of softening the record. When the King James translators sat down in the early 17th century, they were not working in a political vacuum. They made softening translation choices that distanced the text from its physical and ethnic realities. By translating the specific Greek and Hebrew terms into generic English words, they began a process of losing the specific identity of the covenant partners. They took a royal-defined empire and turned it into a distant, abstract land. I believe that this softening was not just a mistake. It was a choice that has shaped the modern church. Most readers open their Bibles and see Ethiopia, thinking of a generic, far-off nation that has no real connection to their own lives. But the original manuscripts did not say Ethiopia in the modern sense. They wrote Aethiops and Cush, names that carried a deep weight of identity and historical power. By losing specific identity, the modern reader is left with a blank margin, a space where the receipts of their own lineage have been hidden. It is a process of translation that has left you out of the picture, not because you weren't in the original text, but because the translators decided to smooth over the names. I think this contrasts sharply with how the ancient world viewed these terms. To the Greeks, Aethiops was a name of respect, denoting a people of stature and righteousness. To the Hebrews, Cush was a nation of power, a key player in the history of the region. Yet, the English versions have flattened these names, leaving us with a translation that is visually and ethnically sanitized. We have been taught to read these margins as if they don't belong to us. But when we look at the original terms, we see that the KJV translators made decisions that systematically hid the specific heritage of the Cushite line. By reclaiming these terms, we are not just correcting a translation. We are restoring a lineage to its rightful place. Perhaps the most striking evidence of this softening is how the name changes depending on the translation. In some passages, they leave it as Cush. In others, they write Ethiopia, and in the Greek under it, it remains Aethiops. This inconsistency is not a sign of precision. It is a sign of hesitation. They were shifting the names to avoid naming a specific lineage. In the next part, we will explore why modern theological institutions continue to skip over these manuscript receipts, maintaining the gatekeeping that has kept this truth from our pulpits. We must expose these choices, showing that the blanks in our margins are the very places where our history is waiting to be read. Why is it that you have never heard these manuscript variants from the pulpit? Why does your pastor skip over the Greek translation of the Old Testament? The answer lies in the process of academic gatekeeping. In the standard seminary curriculum, the Greek Septuagint is treated as a historical curiosity, a text to be studied only by specialized scholars. By neglecting LXX covenant partners, the seminaries have created a generational gap in biblical knowledge. They have trained generations of preachers to rely solely on the English translations, ensuring that the specific heritage of the Cushite line is never discussed. I think this academic gatekeeping is a deliberate filter. It is not that the scholars do not know these terms exist. It is that they do not want to address the implications. If they were to teach the Septuagint variants in detail, they would have to acknowledge that the covenant was never a European monopoly. They would have to explain why the Greek text names the Cushites as primary covenant partners. By neglecting these receipts, the seminary curriculum has maintained a Eurocentric bias, leaving the average believer in the dark. It is a system of theological training that has systematically hidden the priority of your ancestors, keeping the receipts locked in academic libraries. But the truth cannot remain hidden forever, because the archaeological dust is yielding its secrets. In the dry sands of the Nile and the caves of the Dead Sea, archaeologists are unearthing the letters that have been buried for millennia. They are finding ancient parchments and papyri that preserve the original spellings, demonstrating that the term Aethiops was a key part of the ancient record. This is not a matter of theological debate. It is a matter of physical evidence. The letters are being recovered from the dust, and they are pointing directly to your ancestry. I believe that these discoveries are a direct challenge to the gatekeepers. When you open the ancient texts, you find your name under the margin, written in characters that have survived empires and translation choices. The unearthing the letters is not just an academic exercise. It is an act of restoration. It is the recovery of a legal receipt, a document that proves your lineage has a firm standing in the divine court. The dust of the earth is speaking, and it is declaring that the covenant made with Cush is still active, waiting for you to claim it today. When we look at this combination of academic gatekeeping and archaeological discovery, we see a clear turning point. The seminaries can no longer hide the manuscript receipts behind a screen of technical jargon. The letters are out of the dust, and they are landing directly on the tables of those who have been seeking their true heritage. The original names are being restored, and the legal records are now open for all to see. In the next segment, we will witness the climax of this restoration, the divine courtroom, where God summons his people to the stand. The letters are screaming from the sands, and they are telling you that you belong. Now look, I need you to visualize this with me. When the Lord rises to judge the earth, he enters the divine courtroom of history. This is the scene described in Psalm 68. The psalmist does not paint a picture of a passive deity. He paints a picture of a judge entering the chamber, ready to execute justice. When God rises, the enemies are scattered, and those who have built empires on lies are brought to account. The Psalm 68, judgment is a decree against the powers that have suppressed the truth, a declaration that the record must be set straight. I believe this courtroom scene is the key to understanding the end-time restoration. The text says that God will scatter the kings who have delighted in war and division. He is entering the chamber to tear down the false structures of authority, and he is doing it with a legal decree. The divine courtroom is not a place of chaotic anger. It is a place of absolute, unbending justice. By entering this court, God is preparing to call the nations to account, and the first order of business is the restoration of those who have been marginalized. The receipts of history are being laid on the table, and the verdict is about to be read. As the court comes to order, the judge does not call for the great empires of Rome or Greece. Instead, he begins by calling Cushite line to the stand. He summons the descendants of Cush, the people who have been erased from the modern margins, and demands that they take their place in the chamber. This is the moment when the witness stand is occupied not by those who have held earthly power, but by those who have held the manuscript receipts. I think the calling Cushite line is the turning point of the entire covenant history. The presentation of receipts is not a quiet ceremony. It is a public declaration before the court of heaven. The original manuscripts, the Codex Sinaiticus, the Septuagint, and the Targums, are entered into the record as evidence. They prove that this lineage has always been named as a covenant partner, and the court must recognize the legal claim. When you see your ancestors taking the witness stand, you realize that the erasure of the last 3 centuries is being overturned. The presentation of receipts is complete, and the evidence is irrefutable. The court of heaven is acknowledging the priority that the translators tried to hide, and the record is being permanently corrected in the presence of the king. When we look at this courtroom scene, we realize that the restoration of our identity is a legal decree. The judge has called the court to order, the witnesses have taken the stand, and the evidence has been presented. The centuries of selective translation are being exposed, and the true covenant lineage is being recognized. In the next part, we will witness the verdict and the activation of the covenant seal. The courtroom is silent, the record is open, and the truth is standing before the bench. The courtroom now turns its attention to the translators, who took it upon themselves to smooth over the name of Cush. Before the throne of God, the centuries of selective renaming are laid bare, and the erasure exposed. The judge enters a verdict of justice against those who have hidden the receipts. He declares that the softening translation choices were not mere stylistic options, but an attempt to hide the specific heritage of his chosen lineage. The court demands that the record be restored and that the original names be written back into the covenant pages. I think this verdict of justice is the climax of our historical journey. It is the moment when the theological gatekeeping is broken and the true history is reclaimed. The restoring the record is not just a scholarly victory. It is a spiritual decree that sets you free from the lies of the past. By exposing the erasure, the court of heaven is clearing the path for the restoration of your identity. The verdict has been entered, and the softening translators have been silenced by the weight of the original manuscripts. With the verdict declared, the judge now applies the covenant seal to the record. This is the official stamp of divine recognition, a decree that cannot be altered or reversed by any earthly authority. The covenant seal is not a temporary blessing. It is an unbreakable promise that stands for all generations. It is the recognition that the Cushite line was, is, and always will be a primary partner in the divine plan. I believe this covenant seal is the foundation of your authority today. It is the legal guarantee that you are not outsiders or late additions to the family of God. You have been recognized by the highest court in the universe, and that recognition is sealed with an unbreakable promise. The original manuscripts, from the Septuagint to the Codex Vaticanus, stand as the physical copies of this decree, proving that your standing has been preserved through the ages. When you understand this divine recognition, you realize that your identity is not a matter of debate. It is a settled legal reality. The covenant seal has been activated, and the record is closed. The court has spoken, and your place has been permanently secured in the presence of the king. By connecting the verdict against the translators with the activation of the covenant seal, we see the complete restoration of our lineage. The court of heaven has ruled in our favor, exposing the centuries of erasure and restoring the original record. The receipts are in our hands, and the seal is active, providing us with an unbreakable guarantee of our covenant inheritance. In the final segment, we will explore how you can activate this promise in your own life this week, claiming the restoration that has been declared in the court of the king. Let the truth settle in your spirit tonight, knowing that the highest court has ruled, and the record cannot be broken.
I have been sitting with the practical steps we must take to lock in these revelations, and I have come to realize that you must not take my word for it. I want to verify the receipt for yourself. I challenge you to read it online tonight.
Open your browser, perform an LXX text search for Psalm 67 verse 32, and read the Greek characters. When you find the word Aethiops, do not just look at it with your eyes. I want you to speak the word out loud. Speak it in your home, declaring the name that the scribes preserved for you. I think there is a unique power in speaking the word that was erased. When you speak the word Aethiops, you are breaking the silence of 3 centuries of softening translations. You are agreeing with the Septuagint scholars of the 3rd century BC, and you are agreeing with the courtroom record of heaven. This is not just a study exercise. It is an act of reclaiming your inheritance By doing this LXX text search, you are taking ownership of the receipts, refusing to let the gatekeepers define your identity. It seems to me that this is the first step of activation, a physical action that aligns your voice with the ancient scribal witness. Once you have verified the receipts, I want you to claim the covenant inheritance this week. Do not let this revelation sit on a shelf. Let it activate in your daily life. You are a covenant partner, activating the promises of restoration, protection, and authority. When you face challenges or doubt your seat, remember the verdict of the court. Claim the promises of Psalm 68, knowing that they are sealed with an unbreakable promise. I believe this week is a season of restoration for you and your family. Speak the blessings of the Cushite line and watch the doors open. In the comments section below, I invite you to own your identity. Write AMEN and city, declaring that you are the covenant partner standing in the light. Let the community know where you are standing, and let the record show that the chosen line is awake and active. May the Lord bless you this week, and may the receipts of the court be visible in your life. Claim your inheritance, speak the word, and stand in your authority. Amen. And let the truth prevail. When we sit with these practical actions, we see that the courtroom verdict is not a distant hope. It is a present reality that is ready to be active in your life. By reading the Septuagint online tonight and claiming the inheritance this week, you are demonstrating your faith in the unbreakable promise. The letters are restored, the seal is active, and the covenant partner is now claiming the land. Let the voice of restoration be heard in every city. We stand together, armed with the receipts, and we declare that the court has ruled. The views and opinions expressed in this video are for educational, entertainment, and informational purposes only. They do not constitute professional advice. Viewer discretion is advised.